are again. Welcome to the Farm Ed podcast. I'm Ian Wilkinson. I'm a director and co-founder here at Farm Ed. And Sam Lane, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you, Ian. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. You're technical director at Cotswold Seeds. And you also were here with me 9 or 10 years ago when we sowed the Herbal Leys here at Farm Ed, I recall.
That's true, yeah. So I'm really lucky. I've got a sort of dual aspect here. My layer during the week is at Cotswold Seeds over at Moreton-le-Marsh, but we started off here 9 or 10 years ago on some very thin brashy land, didn't we, which had been grown with arable crops for many years.
It was dry, wasn't it? Do you remember
very dry.
It still is, but I mean, that was the key thing on this farm, wasn't it?
Very dry, very stony.
Yeah.
And I think
and not much organic matter in the soil.
No, definitely. It's been worked well over the years, hasn't it? That's for sure.
Yeah.
And I think the idea was to try and get some heart back into the soil was what we first discussed. How do we go about doing that?
Yeah. So the key things for me in those days were, if you have a crop rotation with, wanting to go arable crops, how do you get the fertility in? And okay, of course we could put fertiliser on, but these days that's becoming we're challenged more, aren't we? Let's face it. But the question is, what can you do to rebuild soil? So for me here, as a farmer, albeit a new farmer, I felt very strongly that we had to have a diverse rotation, and the heart of that was going to be the Herbal Ley, because that was the thing that would bring the soil back to life.
I think you're right, and interestingly as well, I think we had a scale issue here. Relatively small farm. Not a lot of machinery, and of course the inputs are expensive, so suddenly having to have a lot of fertiliser and these sorts of things to get the crops growing didn't look particularly viable, and we were looking at other ways of doing it. Herbal Leys, deep roots, legumes of course were the other key part of the factor.
Yeah.
Very lucky we can grow some different legumes up here as well, which is exciting, sainfoins and lucernes, as well as your normal clovers and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I remember there was the Newman Turner book, wasn't it? We both read it, I know, when we were starting out. And there was this saying that you could be your own animal feed manufacturer, your fertiliser supplier, and your vet all in one. And in a way, that's the spirit of these smaller farms, isn't it? Because we don't have economies of scale, so you've got to be pretty efficient, self-sufficient, really. And the Herbal Leys seem to be part of that. And we leave them in here now for 4 or 5 years in the ground before we plough them in, and then grow a crop of wheat or some cereals after them for the fertility. And I have to say, when we started, the soil here was, it was lacking a bit of structure, really. I think that'd be a kind way to put it. And what we now have when we plough it in, and we do plough because we're not using glyphosate on this particular part of the rotation, the structure's better. It's like the soil particles hold together more because of those deep roots.
And interesting, I think when we first dug over some of these fields, we didn't see many worms, which was a bit of a warning shot to what's been going on and what we need to improve. And now I think you'll agree that every time we look into these lays, you see worms starting to get dung beetles. That sort of soil health is coming back, which is great to see.
Yeah, Danielle counts them here now. She's the worm expert, of course, at Farm Ed, but she counts them and she finds that in the sort of monoculture control plots that we have here, which don't have a rotation, and then she compares them to other parts of the farm where we do, and it won't surprise us, of course, I suppose, but there are more worms in those diverse swards, and there's even more worms in the sainfoin, which has been down 9 or 10 years, but the diverse swards, the numbers are right up there, with 14 or 15 earthworms a spadeful, as opposed to 1 or 2 on the monoculture. So it's interesting, isn't it? As a proxy for carbon, I suppose, and soil health, they look pretty good, don't they? So are they catching on? Because you're speaking to a lot more farmers than I am these days.
I think we are seeing an interest in it, definitely. In varying stages, some people are taking smaller steps and maybe adding a few different species to what would be their standard grass or grass and clover lays. Others are jumping in a little bit quicker. And some, of course, you've dealt with over the years who've dealt with these sort of lays for a long time, but they were pioneers, I think, and they were the ones really pushing forward.
Well, interestingly, when I started, so this is for me nearly 40 years ago now, but when I started in the seed business, most farmers, like me, had been trained to produce ryegrass with a lot of fertiliser, and we're really good at doing that. Knew exactly how to do it. And there were 1 or 2 outliers, if you like, in those days, going against the grain, who were describing this, different system. And I know we've mentioned the book, Newman Turner's book, but also, I think it was called Fertility Pastures, but there was also others, the Clifton Park farming system, for example, and others. And I think they're no longer outliers. You know, these are the people I meet now who are using drought-resistant Leys, leguminous Leys, effectively are using those herbal Leys, and they're I guess the price of fertiliser, you know, all these things that come to bear, don't they? And you look at these as an alternative. I mean, they're not for everybody, I'm sure, but for grazing on light land, which is what we do here.
It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it, really? Yeah, yeah. So in your mind, and we could probably even disagree about this between us, what is a herbal ley? How would we describe it, I wonder?
Yeah. Well, I would say, I always describe it as a mixture of grasses, legumes and herbs. And not just one of each, but and then within the group to have different ones. But I don't know how far you would go with a definition where you really tighten
it's tricky.
that down.
I like to keep it open because I think it probably is more attractive to everybody then if you're going to use these sorts of mixes. But certainly a diverse range of different species. And you can make it as complex as you want, of course. But we tend to see probably 4 or 5 herb species, maybe 3 or 4 legumes, I would have said, probably the same again, 5 grasses, and within those you could have, of course, the perennial ryegrass that we've dealt with for years, timothies, so late growing and very long-term traditional pasture plants, high in fibre, cocksfoot, deep rooting on dry land,
early
orchard grass as some people know it. Sometimes had a bad reputation over the years, but I think that's probably more down to management, and we've got newer varieties coming through, which is handy. Softer leaves, less clumpy, tall fescue maybe, so that's your sort of standard grasses probably, but of course there's no one recipe sheet. And within the legumes, red clovers, white clovers, to be a bit more interesting, maybe some of the trefoils, bird's foot trefoil with anthelmintic properties, we can go on to those sorts of things in a minute. Sainfoins, lucernes, depending on the soil type, so there's
they're
a nice
a bit
range
picky,
there.
aren't they? Some of those legumes, especially the forage legumes, but there is something for everyone, I think, isn't there? And what about the herbs then? Because what about chicory? Because there, you know, a lot of people. I mean, it's brilliant on the one hand, isn't it? And it's got this fantastic root, but it does come back a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think we've seen we started here 10 years ago. There wasn't any chicory, and now there is in places we didn't see it. Yeah. But then that's life, I suppose. Yeah. But yeah, certainly with the deep rooting herbs, chicories, done a lot of breeding of those in New Zealand. Plantains as well. I'd say the Kiwis are a little bit ahead of us with those sorts of species. Yeah, certainly they're breeding of those types of things for different varieties. Burnets, deep rooting burnets, yarrows, sheep's parsleys as well. Yeah. And again, there's no single answer to all this, but there's a lot of things you could choose from. And I think the key thing is probably knowing why you're doing it and the soil type they're going to go on to try and get the best things and get the things that are going to grow on those soil types. As you say, sainfoins, lucernes won't grow on the clays. Burnets, the sheep's parsleys.
So what do you do when you've got like you say with the clay? I mean, this soil grows pretty much all of those and more, but and it's sort of for fun, you know. But on a difficult soil like a clay, or maybe even where the seedbeds are tricky to get, or they're acidic or something, or they just lie wet. What do you do there?
I think probably worth tailoring the mixture if it was me, or certainly tailoring the breadth of species we've got. Some we know won't grow on particularly low pH acidic soils, so is it worth having them in if we know they won't do the job?
Do you experiment with them? Do you say to people, try them and then modify the mix, or do you?
Bit of both, I think.
Get-go.
Depending how extreme the situation is. So if we know we're down into 5.5s, 5.6s, I think realistically the acidic loving, the alkaline loving plants aren't going to be happy. But where you've got a bit more marginal stuff, then I think in a way you could start off with quite a nice complex mix, and you might then bring it down a little bit from there. But of course, some things on the heavy soil do really well. So in the grasses, we've got timothy and meadow fescue, really happy. On the legumes, we've got alsike clover, and chicories and plantains do pretty well from the herb point of view. So you've still got a nice list of things there, definitely.
And you said earlier on, I heard you say it, I'm sure you said clovers. You said red clovers and white clovers. So you're not. I'm glad to hear that, because I've always thought that the biggest difference you'll make will be between the species, but there's the fine tuning, isn't there, with selection of individual varieties within a species like red clover, for example.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. As we say with these herbal leys, to get people trying them is a good start, but then you can really start to fine tune them down to the system, the soil type. Things like red clover is a good example. Some have better persistency than others. Some flower later or earlier than others. So again, depending when you want to be out there grazing, do you want an early or a late variety? And within the white clovers, we've got a lot of research on that, a lot of good work done at Aberystwyth. But we can break those down into grazing types, intermediates and larger types for cutting as well. So it's not quite as straightforward as it sounds.
No, it isn't, is it? And what about, I put a bit of buckwheat in here as a cover crop, nurse crop I call it.
Yeah.
I've done it every year, and it sort of comes up. I'm always a bit nervous about grazing it with the sheep. Everyone says we're careful, but I don't know, what do you think? Because it's phosphate I'm after, really. I'm not, it's not a forage plant, but I just have this fear of running out of phosphate because it's a big, it's number 2 plant nutrient, isn't it?
Yeah. We've seen a bit of research, a few papers now looking at the way that phosphate buckwheat can make phosphate available in the soil, especially on these high alkaline soils, possibly an acidic zone around the roots, and it can make it more available to the plant and then obviously to the sward in general. I think the grazing of buckwheat with sheep is interesting. There has been a bit of work done, and it seems to be the pigment or colour of the face of the sheep can determine whether or not it can suffer from phagopyrism, which is a skin disease, or skin disorder, I should say. We have had 1 or 2 customers over the years who have had an issue, and they actually jabbed the sheep and took them off, and they recovered pretty quick. But it's just these things, as we start to use these different species, we've got to be aware of.
So I played options. It safe here because we've got some Romneys here, and we New Zealand Romneys, and we've actually not put them on to graze first. We've run the topper over it, and then we graze a bit later on. And but I have seen them in there, and I've been a bit nervous, because they're not always our sheep.
And of course, with the buckwheat, we know as we get a few frosts at this time of year from now on, that will start to die away. And I think it's probably safer going onto a sward of buckwheat that's dying away, or with other things in the sward as well, than a real fresh sort of motoring cover of just buckwheat on its own in July when it's really green and really lush.
And you mentioned these plants have got amazing qualities, haven't they, for all sorts of different reasons, but you mentioned anthelmintics, we're going to come to that. So what's the score there at the moment? Because as every year goes on, we get a bit more information about why. How are you reading that now?
Interesting. I think you started off some really interesting trial work with some of the local universities, looking at the anthelmintic or anti-worming properties of certain species. One that we're particularly fond of.
So this is anti-worming. So we're clear on this.
Yes.
Not worms as in soil.
This is
not anti. We're not anti-worms.
In the guts.
We're anti-parasitic worms that have
been
living in our sheep or our cows, for example, or goats, for that matter.
And within those trials, we looked at healthy hay, legume plus, and that was looking at specifically sainfoin at the time, which we grow here really well on the Cotswolds. So it's been close to our heart as an interest. And can those plants reduce the worm or parasitic burden within the animals? And we know there's a few others to look at as well. Birdsfoot trefoil, which has a similar way of doing it as sainfoin does, the sainfoin plant, the genetic makeup of the plant. But more recently, some work on chicory having a similar effect, but in a different way. So we need to look more at why it does that.
It's the problem with science, reductionist science especially, is one thing. Might know about the chicory, you might know about the sainfoin. What you don't know is the interactions between them. And you mentioned birdsfoot trefoil too. So there's 3 plants having an anti-parasitic effect. Exactly what's happening there, I don't think we'll ever understand. I mean, there's been a lot of work on it, and we don't worm any sheep here, and or the cows, and I suspect that that's quite sound. And other people are doing similar things. But I know farmers spend an awful lot of money, and from the farmer's perspective, these drugs are, there's a cost of administrating them, and there's a resistance building as well, just in the same way as antibiotics. So I don't really, as a farmer, want to use them if I can avoid it. It's not that I'm against modern medicines, it's just that, there's a place for them, but they shouldn't be overused. And I think, and if there's a cost saving as well, it sort of goes back to the growing your own fertiliser, doesn't it, with these de-rooting legumes. If you can do that, it sort of makes sense to everyone, really. Interesting. So what the future is going to be for these sort of type of mixtures? Because I'm talking to a lot of farmers who are, friends of mine who are, perhaps arable, and they're thinking about how do they get soil fertility back, how do they control blackgrass, and the Leys, back into the arable system seems to be a way forward. Plus, of course, now we had government scheme of the GS4 for a long time, which is a subsidy to allow us to get it here to grow these herbal Leys, and now we've got SFI, the Sustainable Farming Incentive, also with a herbal ley component, which is interesting, isn't it?
I think it's interesting. There's certainly a little bit of incentive to farmers from the stewardship side of things, which effectively is government money, to maybe increase rather than decrease diversity and maybe try and get more of these soil improving lays back on the land. And we've seen that in the last 15 years with the sort of most recent stewardship incumbent, which was countryside stewardship, and as you say, the GS4, effectively a herbal lay, and there was a fairly good payment that went along with that.
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah.
The interesting thing now is we're on the sort of cusp of another stewardship coming through, Sustainable Farming Initiative, SFI, and we're all wrestling with what that means and how that fits into different systems. It seems to have a slightly more open-ended criteria to some of these options. So that might, again, encourage farmers to uptake them, and there are some herbal lay options in there. And the difference being that some of these older options with the stewardship stuff, you had to leave it down for 5 years. Now it might only be 3. So suddenly that becomes a bit more flexible within a rotation. There's a little bit less criteria about what needs to be in the mix. So it could be a slightly simpler mix, maybe easier to tailor that to heavier land or lighter land or whatever the situation might be, cutting for silage or hay. So I think it's all there to take. And I think there's going to be an interest in the next year or so as farmers start to look into the next sort of round of stewardship and government money to see how it fits.
Be really interesting to. I know some of the amazing practitioners, the Rob Richmonds and the Richard Gantlets of people have been using these lays in our times, for some years now. They've been using them for probably 20 or so years. I mean, they're getting quite good results, and they're getting, I think, soil improvement, which is what they're after, definitely, and certainly the case here. You get a sense of it, and I think with the government's general direction of travel, if that does support us farmers to do that, that's a good thing. But I can't help but think that the biggest problem for farmers is going to be a lack of income from the livestock perspective, because livestock farming is really difficult to make money out of. And I sometimes feel, and I perhaps shouldn't say this too much to my friends, but because they'll be ribbing me for it, but I feel like perhaps we should be paying the sheep farmers to come onto our land, because sheep are easy to move around, and I can't help but think that the arable farm, it's really in the arable farmers' interest to have them on, and at the moment there's pennies changing hands, and I think the livestock integration for soil improvement is incredibly helpful and needs some further support, and I don't quite know how it goes, but maybe there's a way to do that, and but if we did, I think we'd see tremendous reintegration of a farming system that used to exist, which of course was livestock in the arable system, and that's gone. The last decade it's been separated. All the animals in the west and all the crops in the east. Well, where's the fertility going to come from unless you pile on the fertiliser? And I can see the fertiliser works, but it's jolly expensive, and it's made from oil and gas.
It's going to be a tricky one, and I think even if we can get the herbal lays or diverse mixes on farm doing good work in the soil, as we know, they can grow a lot of biomass, and that's got to go somewhere, hasn't it? So grazing or something similar has got to happen to utilise it, and then get that cycle working with the muck and manure going back in. Yeah. I think probably maybe a slight reset on how people think about how they value that livestock manure going back onto the system from the landowner or landlord's point of view, and also an appreciation to the stock guys that they need reliable stock guys who are going to be in and grazing at the right time, taking animals away at the right time to carry on the next bits of the rotation. So there's going to have to be a lot of integration going on, a lot of frank chats, I think, around the table, sitting down together and hashing out how they want it to work. And within all that, of course, we need the infrastructure, the water, the fencing, whether that be temporary or permanent. So it's not an easy nut to crack, but we've seen people do it on a big scale, even just around here, so it can be done. Yeah,
it is interesting, and there's some really ingenious methods and techniques going. And I think at the end of the day, we can't eat the herbage stuff that's growing in the fields. And humans can't eat that. So, if we want that integrated back into the farming system for all the sorts of reasons around soil improvement and actually the other thing I've seen as well, the way we're grazing these, because we're grazing only periodically, so we're cell grazing or mob grazing. You get a lot of birds nesting in there. There's a lot of insects buzzing around. So you get a sense that there's a lot of wildlife in that section of the farm, and it's down for 4 or 5 years. So there's a good degree of wildlife being delivered through that farming system, which pleases a lot of people. But we can't eat it. So what can? Well, it's livestock. So it's sort of a nice.
I think you pick up on two good points there. What's going on above and below the ground? We've already said about worms below the ground, but of course you've got a lot of endangered farmland birds at the moment, which will find these as habitats. We get them up here, flocks of goldfinches on chicory that go to seed. We know that looks really great. The pollinators, of course, are a big concern as well. And then add in the actual grazing of these mixes and grazing them correctly. There's a lot of stuff to learn about how to graze them to get the most out of them in terms of biomass, to keep that diversity in there. You mentioned mob grazing, which is quite an extreme version of grazing an area heavily and then moving on very regularly and leaving it to recover. Other people might not have the time. They might be grazing every 4 or 5 days and moving on. And again, back fencing to allow that stuff to recover, to allow things to flower.
I like it. I like going out to see them there because there's a really nice sense of you're with the livestock, and I always take the opportunity to go and move the sheep if I can because it's just a very therapeutic thing to do. And you've got to check them every day anyway, so it's not really not a big deal. Once you've got that infrastructure in, like you say, the water and the fencing. It wasn't when I was younger. Electric fencing was quite hard work. We didn't have the reliability that we've got now. There was no solar panels and all that stuff that comes with the energizers these days. So it's a very different beast. There's all sorts. We use the wrapper stuff here, which, for example, and it's really good. It works, and with mobile water as well, it works. So it's not what it was. Of course, you've got this question with the grazing of the animals being outside a lot, but in the winter they still have to come in, especially on wet ground. So I don't know whether you come across farmers, on a day-to-day basis who are saying, well, it's all right, we can graze, but where are they going to go in the winter? Because, without the buildings and housing, you're in trouble.
And I think you're right. There's definitely still some practical issues that you've got to acknowledge and work around. Soil type and whether it can be outwintered on is one, definitely. Shade in the summer as well. We know some of these big fields in the east are huge and they haven't got any trees anymore. So how do we get around that? Are there new things coming along or different ways of thinking?
Well, maybe it's sort of agroforestry, alley cropping. We get rows of trees between the arable. We've got some here just as a demonstration, and it might be that's the sort of thing we need to be looking at in the future. I don't know. It's fascinating.
It's
the whole thing.
Exciting time, definitely. And what I do see in my day job now so much is people looking forward, looking to the future. All we tend to hear about is the negative, especially in farming and in the wider world at the moment. But there's a lot of interesting things going on. A lot of people really putting thought into how to go forward, and that's where we've got to be.
So you're looking at the modern science and the new techniques and the new way of thinking. I'm looking at the ancient skills, really, because of course these plants were all used, 100-200 years ago. They were commonplace in farm fields, and they've gone. But you're effectively reinventing the role for them, which I think is incredible, and I find it really exciting.
As we've always said, nothing's that new in farming, is it? It's probably happened before if you go back far enough.
Yeah, keep reading the old books. Long live the library. Good to see you, Sam.
Thank you, Ian. Been great to see you.